So I'll just introduce you.
Sure, sure. I'll come hang out beside you. Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay. You don't need me in the frame, do you, for this? Okay, so welcome. This is Jonathan Enns. He's going to be giving a talk on towards an open architecture, and so he's actually from the School of Architecture on campus, and actually we've only met one time before. He actually reached out to me and saw the work I was doing and thought it might be related to what he's doing. And when we had a chat, we had a really great chat, actually, because there is a lot of overlap, I think, between the ideas you have in architecture and the ideas we have, I think, in interactive technologies and tangible and touch computing. And so I think that what you're going to see here is going to be some really interesting possible connections. And so when you listen, try to think about how we could potentially collaborate in the future with Jonathan, because I think there are a lot of potential collaboration opportunities.
Cool.
And just a reminder that you're being recorded, so we'll actually get a chance for a lot more people than are here to see your talk, so don't worry.
Okay, thanks, Mark. You know, I called this, so I just started here teaching in September. I'm coming up from the States where I was working in innovation consulting, but I am an architect. And so I'm coming kind of with an interest in a broader concept of architecture and an attempt to bring in multiple disciplines. So I'll explain a little bit more about that, but what I wanted to talk about is kind of a pitch. Architecture 1.0 versus Architecture 2.0. This is where I think we should go as architects, but I'm interested in pitching it outside of architecture because I think it's going to resonate maybe with some stuff that's happening in other disciplines. I wanted to use this as an excuse for myself to think through architecture and how it intersects with games. Just my thoughts. So I know you guys are way deep in this, and I'll probably present some kind of naive stuff, but these are my thoughts on how it intersects with architecture, and then some crazy ideas about how these things might work together. So architects, and also the font on this, I know you guys might not, architects like worry about font and all kinds of stuff. So we had some like format switching this morning. So anyway, our craft, architects, the funny thing about architecture is that we actually don't make buildings. We make drawings and instructions for the construction of buildings. So what's really changed over the last few years is that the way we make these instructions, like every field, has moved from old school methods of drawing, which frankly was really fun and intuitive and interactive. We've moved into a new set of tools that are about digital production, AutoCAD, 3D modeling, animation software that probably you guys are all familiar with. So for 500 years, kind of the architecture creation process was fairly manual and fairly hands-on and kind of in front of you. And recently, there's been this big shift into the digital space. So that's where we are. I mean, that's where we've been for 30 years. So that's one thing. And architecture 1.0, I mean, I'm kind of making this up right now, so it hasn't been tested too much. But architecture 1.0, to me, it explains how architects have designed. They've kind of designed it top down. You know, you have this image of the architect on the drafting board, and the ideas coming from their brain. And it's been kind of like a one-way, like Web 1.0. It's been one-way communication. And I think where I want to go, and kind of my interest at the school at least, are to shift into a new mode that is back and forth. So where the actual users of architecture, you'd be surprised how little they factor into architecture 1.0. It tends to be like big artistic idea or an economically driven idea, and then the building that's produced is it's not really like, analyzed after the fact, and there's not a lot of real understanding about the problems that people have with buildings. So architecture 2.0 is about involving the user, and it's really about the user and involving them more in the creation process. So architecture 2.0, like Web 2.0, it's a two-way experience. Involves and requires the user for for the architecture to be successful. I'm kind of really excited about this. So I think architecture 2.0 and gaming should be friends, maybe best friends. So I'm really excited to like, meet you guys and talk to you more and see if there's anything common that we're looking at. So I think there's three things that I think of. Immersive environments are increasingly important for architects and have been in the past. So creating an environment for a client that is believable, but that also that environment can be occupied while the design is happening. That's often an important thing. And then user-centered design methods, so ways that we design around the user rather than designing at them. That's another thing that I imagine is probably shared. And then the third is tangible and intuitive controls. So I'm going to talk a bit about each of these areas ahead. So the first category, immersive environments. So why is that important to architecture? Well, architecture is like fundamentally big, right? Like it's so big that to actually, the first time you actually encounter the product will be the first time it's built. You can't really prototype it without building the building twice. So it's big, it's expensive, and so often you really want to be convinced you're making the right decision. So that is something high immersivity, is really helpful. When a client can get an idea, I want the counters here, or the lockers for the students make a lot of sense against that wall, not this wall. So doing that ahead of time is very helpful. I used to do a lot of laser tag. Obviously immersivity can happen. I'm kind of interested in the spaces where this happens in games in physical, but I also realize like the easy one was also, like the digital immersive games seem to be increasingly a place where fantastic architectural design is happening. Like I would say probably, architecture is now digital, and it seems like the best digital and compelling architectural design is actually happening in games, not in architecture. So I mean, I love these scenes where it's both like pulling you in and producing a compelling scene. It's very narrative. I mean, it's very related to the things that architects talk about, but actually at a much better fidelity than we actually work at. So there's a relationship there that I think is really important. A funny story kind of related to that is at Waterloo in the 80s when the economy wasn't doing so well. A number of the graduating architects actually went down to Hollywood to start working on. A number of them worked on Star Wars on the sets. And really, not that that's games, but really we're working in separate and parallel kind of industries to try to build these environments. But increasingly for us as well, what's really important is starting to produce immersive environments in VR. And especially where there's a link between something like a traditional plan and then the VR space, where you can kind of navigate through the different spaces of the home, wearing a set of a VR set, and really understand the home or the space much better than you could in drawings. So that's kind of like the state. That's where we are right now. So this is InventDev company in Toronto that would be really interesting. I mean, I don't know, maybe you guys know them. It would be interesting to work with them. So the real question, I mean, I have, and I think what's really interesting is where the design environment currently, this is current architecture 1.0, the design environment is one space, maybe it's the office or the studio. You spend time and money and you produce an experience environment. So an experience environment for us would be like a render. So you'd spend, $5,000. You'd finish your design. Let's say your house would be designed, and then you'd spend $5,000, and a rendering firm would produce a couple images. You get those back. And what's interesting is it's a tough situation because you want to get your design stable enough that you can spend that money. So where a real promise is in the architecture industry is in merging these so that you're much closer to the experience environment all the time. and it doesn't feel like your design has to stabilize before you invest in a render or something. You're kind of always there. And a lot of these tools that, a lot of the VR that we looked at and a lot of the technology I showed, I think are moving us towards merging these environments. I get really excited about a serious architecture tool that is, that is basically Minecraft. I think a number of people could get on board with that. I mean, and I know there are people trying, but I really do wonder, like, what if we take this seriously and say, I mean, we're building with voxels and we're building these fun environments, but it's pretty close to, if we could figure out what the material modules are, the alphabet of actual pieces of material, this could be the beginning of a real online architecture custom interface. So that's where I think the two could merge, where you could always be in the representation. So that's kind of immersive environments. I guess maybe I'll save questions for the end. Is that okay? Yeah, I'll save questions for the end. Kind of the second, I think, common chapter or theme between the disciplines might be the kind of importance of the user in designing. So this text is crazy, but why would the user be important in architecture 2.0? I think one, we spend so much time indoors. I mean, like, everyone's in this environment in this building all the time, right? And increasingly, with the need for air conditioning, or let's say the climate gets a little warmer, being inside might be something that we have to do a lot. But recently, we've been given some really, really amazing analytical tools to understand the impacts of environments on people. And I think now that we know that spaces can aid in wellness or do the opposite, it's really important that we take that seriously and try to craft spaces that produce happy, healthy people if we can. So I think, like, making the occupant really spending time focusing on them is important. I'm wondering, how can we put the user of architecture as central to the production of architecture as it is in games? So on the left, this is, does anyone know this building? This is Boston City Hall. You know this building. It's not a very, human-centric user, there wasn't much human-scale attention paid when designing this building. It's big. It doesn't really talk about welcoming you as a citizen of Boston. It's kind of like a fortress. So I feel a little more intimidated and scared of this building than I do, like, really wanting to enter it. So just to kind of give a concrete example of what I'm talking about, I mean, a user-centered building might be something more like, this is Sinus Alto Town Hall in Scandinavia, done by Alvar Aalto around the same time, where a lot of attention is paid to the size of the steps and the materials and the fact that people are always touching wood when they walk through the building. There, at least in this building, was a real attention to human scale. So we could do a lot more of that. I also think that users can become the designers of buildings, and that some of the methods that we use to design in committee or in groups are not all that far away from games sometimes. So here we have, a group of, there's an example that actually is about taking design games seriously. But you're often with a group of people that are trying to make decisions together, and designing together, whether with sticky notes, could actually become much more formatted and much more like an object-oriented game. I think also, architecture can start to adopt a product design methodology and set of steps that we go through. So this I just stole from IDEO in terms of how they develop products, but this is kind of the set of steps that I would imagine that are gone through to develop a product, maybe a game that has to go onto the market, that also could be shared by a user-centered architecture. And what's new for architecture is that we don't do a lot of this. We don't actually do, like, I've seen UX studies, or you actually have to study how this is going to work. We actually don't do this a lot. So So going into people's homes, asking them about, you know, if the door, you know, swings into the bathtub, and how that's really working. You know, these little things are actually something that I think is done more in other disciplines and could be brought into architecture. There's some interesting older projects that started going that way. Yona Friedman had an amazing, you know, idea about a big city that people kind of designed themselves. So it was really about participatory design, and that's something I'm really still interested in. So Yona Friedman had this idea of architecture without architects. So how could you design using a set of kind of systems and rules, but remove the kind of overseeing paternal architect from the equation and just design with the computer? I think this is still a great question. So we got about, you know, this far, and it's not, I don't even think myself or my colleagues are worried about that. I don't think we have to talk about the worry of removing architects because there's always going to be an artistic function. I think the question is, can we get people, or is there a way to allow people to have better, be able to have better design tools that are accessible to them? So a few things I've been looking at recently. I mean, IKEA has actually been doing some amazing stuff that verges on, I think, both games and architecture. You know, they have their VR designer where you can wear a VR headset and then customize your spaces. Other companies, this is Design Home, but really it gives you a space and you get to test out a library of furniture that you could then buy. It's really about, I mean, I think it's about visualization and kind of testing, and then giving a limited set of options, giving the power to change a limited set of options. Back to IKEA, doing augmented reality stuff. I think this is all stuff that is working at the scale of furniture that could work really well at the scale of, slightly larger scale of buildings. So just to tie a bow on that last comment, there was a really cool exhibition at the MoMA called Home Delivery where they talked about kind of the history of modular design. And there's an interesting overlap in architecture between this potential to customize parts, change colors, pick ABC, and modular design. So if we actually designed our buildings, like this building you can see here, as a kind of alphabet of pieces, it would give the ability to then design that back-end configurator. So really what's tough about architecture is that, you know, it's so big, it's so expensive, it's so heavy. But if we could design and conceptualize the material side, it opens up the ability to design that, the software side. And so, I mean, admittedly, my expertise is on the material side, on figuring out what are the alphabet pieces, what are the pieces and parts that will produce a good building that will make people happy. And I'm really excited about options for finding ways of building that back end. There are some people doing it. So Blue Homes is a California builder, and they build very expensive modular homes that you can design online. So here you can pick, you know, do you want filter by, you can filter first of all. So there's a bunch of kind of pretty standard ways of picking, trying to find the thing you want. But then it also lets you customize to a certain extent. This could get a lot more interesting, I think, and I think there's a lot of potential there. Okay, and then the kind of last theme area that I'm really interested in talking about are tangible and intuitive controls. So if we are moving towards the user and towards participatory design, we need to have design tools that are easy to use and understand. So I think, you know, architects can learn a lot from games, like, you know, Mousetrap. I don't know if it's in there. It's just, you know, there's a certain craft to producing even an intuitive piece, the way it clicks, the way it looks. But how can you develop a tangible construction kit that makes it clear what the rules are? I think that's an interesting question. I think the aspect of fun is really important and is missing from the architectural tool set. It's not that fun, actually, to design buildings. It's actually not fun. And I think this is an interesting discussion to have in the future. I'm still not totally. I think there's an interesting question about the distinction between games and toys. And is a toy, like, could architecture be a toy, and the game is the rule book or the set of objectives that you can give to that toy? Anyway, there's something in there about an interesting potential to make architecture fun, or an architectural kit fun. Right now, the intuitive aspect of architecture is really in the intuitive and hands-on aspect of architecture is in the model building. So these are models from a project I was working on, but are pretty common, where you will build by hand a set of, we would call these massing models because they're low detail, but they're radically different options, sizes of buildings. So a client, we would present this to a client, where you'd present the first, you can obviously see that these are different, and we discuss the difference in the options. And there's a certain decision making that happens around models that just doesn't happen around images. I don't know how that would be different with virtual reality. I would imagine there would be differences as well. It would be really cool to study them. But I can say that the model is a really successful design tool for decisions with clients. So we use it, and it's really helpful. This is just another, so if this is the large-scale decision-making that happens in architecture, it can get down to some detailed decision-making where you're talking about, I don't know if you guys can see this, but there's a layout printed on the bottom of that model, and you can basically make a model out of foam, and you'd be able to tear out walls and stick them back in. So there's a certain amount of flexibility that can happen at this scale. But again, the difficulty of the physical model is there's an expense to making changes. So if that client all of a sudden wants this building not to look like a K, but a W, there's an expense to remaking that model that, frankly, today often gets avoided. It's getting expensive. So just a few more older examples that I love about models and the need for physical interactive design tools. This was Gaudi. So all of the arches in the Sagrada de Familia are actually designed with hanging weights. And so you could have this real interaction where you'd hang another weight, or you'd lengthen the cord to really design the geometry of the church. And there's also something beautiful about, like, the hanging cords are actually approximating a very functional structural form. So this was like a great interactive device. There's a Swiss architect engineer called Hans Eisler who would teach his students to study. He was interested in thin shell domes, very, very thin concrete, and they'd just simply cast them hanging out of plaster and lay weights on them just to see how do they fail, actually interact with the forces. So these Heinz Eisler, sorry. You'd end up with this, but you'd kind of start here to try to understand how many rest points you need, how it might fail. I mean, it was the first, you get a real physical interaction with how the thing fails, which is really cool. And then just general architects do a lot of different models. They still build a lot of models, but it's getting more expensive. So this was a great exhibition by Herzog and Demiron, which are Swiss architects. They get paid a lot, so they can build a lot of models. So I mean, I'm kind of interested in the average architect and what happens when you don't have Herzog Demiron funds. Frank Gehry, beautiful models. This is kind of like the model that comes out at the end. There's no kind of development and ripping and pulling that happens too much with this model. But more often than not, we're really building digital models and really looking at different images on screens. So this is the Frank Gehry building. And really that's because we have all these great analysis tools. You can look at insulation, you can look at sun, you can look at shading, you can look at the impacts of carbon, all can be simulated in AutoCAD or in CAD programs. So there's this is getting sticky. It's getting hard to get out of this. And so my big question is what's kind of happening to the decision-making process as we get more inherently jammed in the digital space. So that's life, looking at a screen more often than not. And so, I mean, I'd been looking at the work coming out of the Tangible Media group where, I have an architect's perspective that's probably missing some of the theoretical underpinnings, but the interest in making the digital controls physical, I think, is a great question for architects. And I like their kind of statement that radical atoms is the vision for the future of interaction with hypothetical dynamic materials in which digital information has physical manifestations so that we can interact directly with it, as if the iceberg had risen from the depths to reveal its sunken mass, the iceberg being digital environments. So I think architects need partnerships to do these things because we are not the experts of digital craft, but I think that there's huge potential for these partnerships to shape how architecture is even conceptualized. Tangible Media Group's doing super cool stuff. There's also kind of like if that's the digital side, there's the physical equivalent of that, which is, I mean, needs development, but is kind of looking at, okay, building buildings using kits and building physical kits that really represent not just like an abstract version of the house, but are really getting close to the actual things you need in the house. So that's kind of like a fun, this is ArcKit. And it's a much more detailed like Lego concept, which is another really interesting project that could happen with more detail. And then you texture it, and you kind of are given all of the. I could imagine giving this to a friend, and here you can see you're almost given all of the tools that you'd need to get pretty close to a realizable design. So me, I had been really interested in prefab. And in, again, asking these questions about versions and prefabricated architecture. This was a concept project called Timberlink, which was an all-timber structure using like no studs, but just solid timber. So if you imagine all the parts in this building, there'd be many fewer parts than there would be in a normal building. I was interested in the most low-res building you could get. That was its own kind of project, but related to some of these issues. I was looking at the parts and the production methods that you need to get you a prefabricated building, kind of the logic of construction. And what ended up at the end was a kind of concept that, okay, different rooms are going to be blocks, kind of like Lego. And these blocks could be put together in a kind of like a base logical arrangement, but then given this ability to deform. So I would imagine there'd be a possibility of having a system that the relationships were set generally, but could work on many different sites. So I can imagine deforming this for one site where, for instance, maybe there's a road that curves around here, so you might deform it to fit the road. Maybe in another instance, there's a view to a river or something. And this was getting towards an idea about an open or an adaptable architecture. These were some of the more detailed kind of results of that. And this is just talking about, the variability would happen in the angle between stacks in the building. And so what I became really interested, or a big question is like, who designs this and how do you make decisions if you kind of have this very, very flexible form, the difference between pushing it a little bit and pulling a little bit. I mean, how do you figure out what the right answer is? So I worked with a friend, Daniel Hambleton, who has a company called Mesh, and we started thinking digital. We were like, well, why don't we figure out a physics simulation? And what I mean by that is, let's do a digital version where you can push and pull, and you'll be able to kind of arrange this thing, but it'll stay in a chain. It'll preserve a certain set of relationships. It was interesting, but it still was really hard to manipulate. Not intuitive. And I just kept coming back to the model. And so I guess these remain, some of these remain projects to be developed, but I took this forward in the kind of ArcKit logic and tried to see if I could develop a set of constraints for a scaled model that would mirror the full-scale building. So these are kind of like scaled down sizes of the modules that would clip together with the right orientations using little clips. And then you could clip them sideways to aggregate the units. And then you could slide them and rotate them to kind of the same extent that the full building would be allowed to slide and rotate. So the attempt would be, don't let the kind of user make any crazy overhangs that we couldn't actually do in the real thing. So that would be a project to continue, but it was a first stab that actually involved a bit of very mechanical design. And here you can just see some of the deformations that a user could make in the building. I could imagine giving this design interface, let's call it, at the moment, to a city or to a community up north to kind of mass out a version themselves, and then with a little more work, add some intelligence to it. A bit of a diversion, just to say it hasn't all been buildings, it's been other kind of systems. So, using magnets, the thought being, okay, could we develop a kind of structural system that was also open? So this is the beginning of a center of a node that would have like structural struts attached to it.